Hi everyone. Hi, thanks for coming along. Do keep coming in and sitting down. My name's Eleanor, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's Big Questions. Thanks so much for coming along. It's great to have you here. Big Questions, if you haven't been before, basically does exactly what it says on the tin. So each week we look at a big and important question relating to meaning and purpose or life. And this week, we're going to be looking at the really important topic of whether or not the Gospels are reliable, particularly focusing on John's account of Jesus' life. And we've got Dr. Pete Williams here, who's going to come and help us think through this topic by giving us a short talk. Then there'll be time for some discussion around tables, and then there'll be a Q&A session after that. Dr. Pete Williams is an affiliated lecturer here. And he's also the chair of the International Greek New Testament Project, which is the UK's biggest project looking at John's Gospel. Please do text in your questions throughout the talk. The number that you'll need for that is on the pillars and on the lectern here. And without further ado, Pete Williams.
Well, it's great to be with you, and great to get lunch as well. What is John's Gospel? Well, very briefly, you probably know David Suchet did some brilliant recordings of the Bible, and it took him 2 hours, 3 minutes to read out loud at a nice slow pace John's Gospel. You'll find it in any Bible in the New Testament as the fourth book, and I'd really encourage you to read it. I don't think there's anyone who studies the fourth Gospel, John's Gospel, who doesn't think it's worth rereading. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is its trustworthiness, and I want to look at 3 lines of argumentation. Firstly, I want to look at, is the text itself reliable? Secondly, we're going to look at the question of the author's knowledge, whether the author has the knowledge to write reliably. And then finally, we're going to look at the question of whether we can trust the character of the author and the main person in it. But I want to start with talking about textual reliability, and we're going to go straight to Queen's most famous alumnus, Desiderius Erasmus, who, of course, from 1510 to 1515, was in Queen's in the eye staircase. The next year after leaving Queen's, he came out with the world first. It was the world's first ever printing of the Greek New Testament. So printing invented around 1450. Why did it take 60 years or more before someone first thought it would be good to print the whole New Testament in Greek? Well, he was the person what done it first. And this is what came out, and there is, as the part of the Festival of Ideas, there's even a display on a copy on display at Queen's. Apparently, I haven't seen the copy myself. And the interesting thing is, he makes this edition of the Greek New Testament based. He's actually in Basel when he does most of the work, not at Queen's, I'm sorry. But he's only got 2 manuscripts of John's Gospel, Greek manuscripts from the 12th century. Well, if Christians are saying that John was written by a disciple of Jesus, therefore from the 1st century, that gives you a lot of time for things to go badly wrong. I mean, we're talking about 11 or 12 centuries for things to go badly wrong. Things could have been miscopied. If those scribes in the 11th century or the 10th century or the 9th had not done their job, poor Erasmus is going to be stuck, isn't he? He's not going to be able to give us a good edition of the Greek New Testament. Well, the story goes on with a bit more of a Cambridge bent. Here we have the opening, by the way. You can't necessarily read that, but this is the very first printing. Maybe you can see the big capital letter E there, and maybe an N there for in. In the beginning was the word. And you can see, if you spent the time to see it, you'd see it's really just like the Bibles that we have today. Go on to another Cambridge story, skipping over Richard Bentley, the master of Trinity, to some other Trinity alumni. And what you've got here is Fenton John Anthony Hort and Brooke Foss Westcott. Westcott, famous for, well, Westcott House, which is opposite Jesus College, named after him. These were more famous in their day than many of the Cambridge scientists, believe it or not, even though most of us haven't heard of them, because they brought out a best-selling edition of the Greek New Testament. And by their day, they actually had 4th century manuscripts, and that's really sweet. So in other words, the evidence had gone back a whole 800 years, and guess what? You can look at their edition, you can zoom in the beginning was the word, and you will find, when you've got that opening section of John's Gospel, there is nothing different from the edition that Erasmus did, based on witnesses 8 centuries later, except for spelling. Well, time could go on, because now there are witnesses from the 3rd century. You can zoom in, and again, you'd have to come up close, but I'm not going to invite you up right now. You can keep eating. And you could see that they have basically the same thing, or this one is from around the year 200. Now, one of the very interesting things that goes on is as that gap between the earliest witnesses of the text of John and the date, supposedly, of John's Gospel has got narrower and narrower and narrower, as you got more and more evidence that things have been reliably handed down, our society has become more and more sceptical about the idea that things could be reliably handed down. Which is really interesting to me, because it really shows that the amount of societal belief or doubt you have in particular things bears no correlation in some aspects with the amount of evidence you have. So there were those people back in the 16th century sitting there in Queens and other places thinking, there's Erasmus, doing a really good job on this. And everyone thought, yes, he's a good scholar. And guess what? He turned out to be right, because what he was able to print in the 16th century based on 12th century witnesses actually has turned out to be what you find in 2nd century witnesses now. Or witnesses from around the year 200. And we can go a little bit earlier into the 2nd century, not with a complete opening of John's Gospel, unfortunately, but we can spot check, I'm afraid. In Manchester and in the other place, you have witnesses from the middle of the 2nd century. So in other words, as time goes back, you basically find that the English Bibles and the other Bibles translated from the Greek aren't having to change. So in terms of gospel reliability, the reliability of the text, there's one big question in John's Gospel. I don't think it is much of a question, which is actually there's a passage which got verse numbers in 1551 from end of chapter 7 for 12 verses through to chapter 8, which is not in the earliest manuscripts, and people back in Erasmus's day knew there were doubts about it, and modern Bibles mark it off and say this was probably added later. And guess what? The nice thing about that is it shows exactly what happens when someone does try and add things to the text, because actually you get a sort of bit of a textual explosion with all sorts of different witnesses turning up. By the way, the earliest copy of that is in the UL, as is the earliest copy of the Ten Commandments. Did you know that? But anyway, that's just the bursting on the subject of the text. So you could argue against the reliability of the text of John if you want, but don't try and argue that the Greek play that people have recently seen has been reliably handed down and that John is unreliable. I mean, you are free to set yourself up against the basic consensus of careful Cambridge textual scholarship over centuries if you want. Just, be reasonable. Okay, let's go on to the next point, which is just a question of how much does the author know? Do they know enough to get things right? The actual content. So in terms of things handed down, I can't prove to you that everything's been handed down without change, because that would be proving a negative. And we all know that that's just an impossible thing to do. Even if I could show you a copy from 5 minutes after the thing was written, how could you show it hadn't changed? So I'm not coming to you suggesting that I can prove to you things haven't changed. Sometimes what happens is people come along expecting a sort of proof which doesn't exist in the relevant area. What I want to talk about, does the author have enough evidence to be able to get things right? Author's knowledge. And one of the things we can find about John's Gospel, I'm sorry this is too small to read, but I will just summarize what's going on in 3 quotations. And that is that basically you have people who are known and documentable. So there's a man who is allegedly a disciple of John, who wrote the Gospel, who happened to die as a Christian martyr. And then there's someone who studied with him, who happened to die as a Christian martyr, who was also Bishop of Lyon, Irenaeus, many will have heard of. And what happens just 2 generations after John is this person who's dying as a very sincere Christian. He actually has a copy of John's Gospel in front of him. He quotes some of the wording of John's Gospel and says that comes from the Apostle John. And you might say, well, so what? What's the significance of that? In terms of attestation, that is better attestation than you have for almost any ancient classical work. How do you know that Aristophanes wrote his plays or Plato wrote the dialogues or anything like that? How do you know? Not because you've got someone a couple of generations after him saying, I have this in front of me and the wording is such and such, and this person that I know wrote about it. Usually it's that you have some list much later that says Plato wrote these things, and then you find a late manuscript which has Plato, and you look at the consistency of style, and that's why many of the things that are attributed, I think rightly, to classical authors are attributed to them. It's not that you actually have people who are able to verify the relationship between the wording in the text and the text itself in the same way. So by all means be skeptical about John's Gospel, but if you're going to be skeptical about John's Gospel being by John, therefore by someone who actually knew Jesus, make sure that you're also skeptical about all the other things that people believe they know from the classical world. Going on then specifically, we could go through the 21 chapters, the 2 hours worth of text, but we don't have time. But when you read things, you read about specific knowledge. So when you haven't been to a city before, obviously you can look it up online nowadays and find out all sorts of things. But in the ancient world, it's actually quite hard to do research if you're going to write good, plausible fiction or something with verisimilitude. It's going to look hard. It's going to be hard. And when we look at John's Gospel, we find the names of characters are right for the time and place. You can... It's got geographical knowledge, local language, knowing Aramaic, how that differs from Greek, and so on. That's just part of what's known. It knows specifically about the temple, how long it took to build, knows specifically about Jewish theology, knows specifically about the neighbouring Samaritans and some of the geography there, and knows about the layout of a particular place in Jerusalem, which was destroyed quite early on. And we could go through and try and build a case that whoever wrote it has to have been of a certain kind, because otherwise it's really hard to get that sort of knowledge. Now, of course, you can make up a mega complicated hypothesis that someone did a massive amount of research in order to write essentially a fictional book, or, you can do that. It's just a much more expensive hypothesis in terms of what you have to posit, rather than supposing that someone basically reliably wrote down what they saw. I want to take us to an account which is in all four Gospels, which is the feeding of the 5,000. This idea that Jesus was able to give a small number of loaves of bread and small number of fish to his disciples, and they were able to feed 5,000 men, excluding women and children. The women and children got fed, but they just weren't counted, because that was the way people counted back then. We can rail against that if you like. But the point is that this is a story of something, freakily miraculous, I suppose. And I can't verify a miracle to you, but what I can say is one of the things I've done in a previous job was I used to prosecute plagiarism, which is really interesting. Could be traumatic for people at the time. When you got two identical scripts, who's copied from whom, and you would get them in, and people would tell you marvellous stories about how things had ended up in the text quite the way that they had. And some of them rang true, and some of them didn't. And there are all sorts of marks of truth, veracity. So one of the things we find is that often true accounts have subtle agreements with each other, agreements that are so subtle that it's unlikely that the person has actually thought of them in order to make their story, agree with another story, because actually someone else's story, because actually it's so subtle, the danger is you'd actually miss it. And this is the sort of thing that you get going on in this account. So what we have is Mark's Gospel, John's Gospel, both talking about the grass. I know it'll be hard to see. I'll just read out what happens, and talking about how green it is, how much there is. Mark tells you loads of people are travelling around, but he doesn't tell you why. But John's Gospel tells you it's Passover time. Now that's interesting, because at Passover time we know lots of people travelled to get to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the festival. So those two things subtly agree, but they agree in such a subtle way you can't say one was made up in order to make it look corroborate the other, unless you want to go for the really hyper-conspiratorial view. Then we have this strange thing in John's Gospel where Jesus turns to one of his disciples with a Greek name. Two of the 12 disciples got Greek names. Philip's one of them. And then Philip and the other one, Andrew, with the other Greek name, they reply. Why does he turn to this particular disciple and start asking where to get bread from? Well, the Gospel of John doesn't tell us. But Luke's Gospel tells us that this feeding took place near Bethsaida. It's the only Gospel that tells us the town which was next to the place of the feeding of the 5,000. And the interesting thing is, if I read earlier in John's Gospel, I see that these two disciples were from Bethsaida. Now, the point of this, if I read John's Gospel on its own, I see absolutely no significance to why he would turn to this disciple and have a conversation with him, and then he and another disciple will get back. None whatsoever. It's only when I plug in information from an entirely different text by a different author that suddenly it makes some logical sense why he would pick on Philip to talk to. Even the little detail, you have barley loaves, fits with when you've just had the barley harvest and it's Passover time. But would the grass have been green? Well, if it was Passover time, we know roughly what time of year it is, and so why not get a precipitation chart from a nearby town and plug that in? And yes, would grass have been green? Yes, you bet you've had 5 of the greatest months of precipitation. So in other words, there's a certain plausibility to the account. Now you might say, well, that doesn't show me that a miracle happened. Of course it doesn't. But some people, when they think about miraculous accounts, think that they happened because people essentially whispered the story one to another, and the story got gradually corrupted. The problem about this is the mechanism for the corruption of information can't be selective. It's very hard to have a mechanism which corrupts through carelessness the big, really important stuff, namely about how many people got fed, and preserves carefully the really unimportant stuff, such as some of the small dialogue. So that's the problem. If you want to say these stories arose because we all know urban legends can just grow up in this particular way, it doesn't really explain the text. So that would be a problem. I want to look finally at the subject of trust. This is an important thing. What a lot of people want is a mathematician might come in here and say, I want a mathematical proof of the reliability of John's Gospel. And of course they wouldn't. Because they know that mathematical proofs exist because we've got an agreed set of rules and you can go from the beginning to the end. That's same informal logic in philosophy. And people can come in and perhaps some scientists might say, well, what's the experiment I could do? And perhaps some historians would say, can you verify things and corroborate them in multiple ways? And I say, I can't offer you any of those for the reliability of John's Gospel. I can give you corroboration of various things in it. But actually, we don't live our lives that way. When my wife says to me, I've been out for a walk, I don't say, can you corroborate that? I trust her. I actually believe it. And we actually live our lives trusting people all the time. The whole of science is built on trusting people. The whole of our lives, what you eat. If you don't trust, you die. You may not have food from tins, but you still trust the sources, the alleged sources of this food. Does anyone here grow all of their own food and produce their own seeds? And sorry, we all trust. If you don't trust, you die. So we're constantly placing our life in trusting other people. It's amazing how little checking out some people do before they make themselves really quite vulnerable in a relationship to someone who could really hurt them in a big way. And what the Bible, I think, offers when it comes to the subject of Jesus is the same sort of evidence for trustworthiness that we are all capable of seeing, namely trustworthiness of person. We all have to decide all the time whom to trust and whom not to. If it were some sort of scientific proof, that would privilege those who had access to that sort of evidence. Actually, it's much more democratic than that. It's something that everyone is able to see. Now, what I want to argue is that John's Gospel can be trusted by the sort of normal criteria that we use to trust things. If we say, like a history department, we have a problem. There was a former master of Peterhouse, Hugh Trevor Roper, great historian of the Second World War, a professor of modern Hebrew in Oxford, totally wrecked his career when someone briefly showed him some diaries and said, I think he's from Adolf Hitler, he was a bit of a rush, didn't have much time to look at it, and he said, yes, probably, I'm only giving you a provisional view. Everyone remembers him for that huge gaffe as a historian. There's another professor from the other place who, when he was shown or told about the Dead Sea Scrolls, he said, almost certainly forgery. And he was wrong. And what's really interesting is that someone is so much more penalized in history and similar departments for believing something which is false than for not believing something that's true. Now, I want to say that history departments are great. They really are. And it's really good exercise to say what can we corroborate and what can we verify and so on. But we don't live our lives like that. If your best friend comes to you, and I'm sorry to use this illustration if it hurts anyone, and says, I've been raped, you don't ask her for history department level verification before you support her, right? In other words, we live our lives differently. Sometimes we trust the testimony of a single person, a single Holocaust survivor. We have to trust them. And what John's Gospel presents itself as is testimony. Constantly read the book, you will find this is presenting itself as testimony. And therefore it has to be looked at that with that irreducibility that testimony has. It comes to you and you have to ask the question, do I believe this? And that's the sort of question we ask all of the time when we're dealing with people. And what we find is the testimony it bears is about this character Jesus, and it makes such enormous claims about who Jesus is that it's hard to think of some way that you could mathematically demonstrate this or use analytical philosophy or anything like that. Because what it's claiming is that Jesus, these are the opening words, is the Word, that is God's means of communication to humans, who's actually God himself and has become a human and is the thing that the Rion temple with its 400-ton stone bases is pointing towards as the way you can be present with God. He's the one who can rescue humanity. He's the way to God. He is the vine that you need to be connected to, that he is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. I mean, all these sorts of things. Some of them are more metaphorical, some of them more literal. But the point is, it's making a massive load of claims about this. And the question is, if God were there and he were going to communicate to us in a person by sending his own son to embody himself and show who he is to people, what testimony would be necessary? What evidence would there be? And I think that John's Gospel presents you with exactly that sort of evidence. It presents you with the testimony of people who can talk about how this individual has come into the world. Look at the teaching that you have in John's Gospel. I just encourage you to go away and read it for yourself and see whether you believe it's credible. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete. Do keep testing in your questions. We've got a question and answer time coming up, but now we've got a couple of minutes just to discuss what we've heard around our tables.